Welcome back for Module D, Chapter 1, Penetration Tester. You know, funny thing, we changed the name to pen test, as I mentioned earlier, as kind of to avoid triggering language. But once you get in the material, every other word in this book is penetration testing. All right, so we are going to talk about scoping, what threat sources look like, and who the bad guys are, and then how to choose appropriate targets and how to model various threats to attack those targets. So all in all, interesting stuff. So we need to figure out the following things about our scoping, right? So what are our goals? If we are doing some kind of deep, in-depth red team exercise, they might be pretty broad. If they're just a compliance deal, they might be pretty narrow and look more like just a checklist of things we're going to try. In terms of targets, who's going to be inside of scope determines who it is we're going to be allowed to attack. Where are they? Are they locally hosted? Are they remotely hosted? If they're remotely hosted, do we have get out of jail free cards from AWS or from Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud Compute that says we're allowed to go through and do that work? What sort of threat actor will our pen testers be simulating? So if we're just simulating script kiddies, maybe we're just doing that HD Moore's Law level of penetration testing. If we're trying to simulate an advanced persistent threat from a government-sponsored adversary, it's a different deal. And we're going to have more tools available in scope to us than we might otherwise. If script kiddie is our adversary that we're emulating, maybe physical penetration testing's in scope because we could have some random kid walk through here and do something dumb. Part of the plan. What is our strategy for this? Again, broadly speaking, are we white box so we know everything going on in the network? Are we black box so we don't? If we want real insight, is it worth paying the extra money for the black box test, knowing that it's going to take our pen tester a lot longer to get their job done, coming through with all that? So that's the broad strategy question. In terms of risk acceptance, how much are we willing to let our network potentially be compromised in some sort of damaging way over the course of this penetration test? If we're very risk averse, if we're in a very sensitive, like if we're handling plutonium, maybe we don't want the plutonium handling systems to be messed with. If we're like a large processing firm that handles poisonous or volatile materials, maybe those we're not going to be willing to let you mess around with those, or we're going to need to schedule a special time where those are in a non-dangerous state during the course of the test. Somebody's got to sign off on that and figure out just exactly how much impact to our regular operations we are willing to put up with for that, for the scope of that test. Like, how long are we willing to put up with our network being, full of scanning packets or potentially, Hail Mary passes from Armitage or whatever you're using to try and break the network. Back to pen testers having to work nights. When are we going to allow those pen tests to go? The availability of the blue teamers goes down during most evenings, unless. So my response to my TA who was working in the healthcare industry was, normally we would be on call when those sorts of tests were underway. Normally we're on call anyway, all day, every day. But I worked in a 24/7 business. I guess if you have a business that shuts its doors at 5 and doesn't start doing business again until 8 a.m., it's a different story. And then, do we have any weirdness going on? I mentioned all of those cloud service providers. If you're penetration testing against those systems, that might be some specialized engagement. Um, if you're evaluating some other organization security, like somebody who you get a service from or somebody who's part of your supply chain, um, that can get tricky. And you may or may not be able to get those other folks to a point where they're willing to have you goofing around on their network. You, you could get lucky. They might be willing to let you do that, but probably not. So all of that goes into consideration while thinking about scope. So we've got a couple of flavors of threat actors we'll worry about. Um, if there are genuine, like, bad guys coming to get you, some kind of legit adversary. Are we emulating one of them? Are we emulating an internal adversary? That can be a problem. Disgruntled IT guy being a favorite trope for that. Or outside the network. So are we defending against Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear and other nation state intelligence services? Those are legitimate malicious actors whose intention is to do you harm. There's plenty of just whoops, I clicked the wrong button, or I opened up my computer and I was accidentally browsing on the server. There's stuff that breaks, you know, like literally the structure of a building could fall apart. Probably not a threat you're going to be concerned with um, for a pen test. However, I did have a VP of engineering whose threat to every organization every business unit he ever walked into was that he was allowed to pull one plug at any of the business units, and that business unit better continue making money without a single interruption. So we were into redundancy, but his deal was always like he could emulate a structural failure of at least one component, and we better be competent enough to be able to handle that, which I always thought was very fun. But um, you can a hardware failure definitely something you can put in scope for a pen test, or a software system going offline. Um, any of the I mean, you could get cute and like fire alarms. Are fire alarms in scope? Do you have a Halon fire suppression system? Have we tested that? And then environmental stuff, like the fire that a Halon suppression system would be designed to take care of, or your average earthquake or tidal wave or whatever. Those are threat sources. There's NIST special publication 830 that will define those for you. If you're really dying for some exciting reading, all of the 800 series NIST publications are great. But certainly, like UPS failures might be in scope on a pen test, or if we can emulate a UPS failure by triggering it to shut itself down somehow, could find themselves into a security test, I suppose. But those are the official ones from our friends at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. I think that's right. Who are the threat actors? We can define them on a bunch of axes. Axes? Axi?
Axes, I believe.
Axes? Yeah,
I think that's the right one.
that didn't sound right. Sometimes though, like you get those words where if you write them a bunch of times, they start to look misspelled. I feel like that's it. So, what are these are ways we could define our our threat actors. What is their intent? Are they a bad guy who is out to just knock us off the internet because they're mad at us? So somebody who's trying to just pull a DDoS on us. Um, are they motivated by money? So I think all of us pretty much have to worry about the Russian mob as a potential threat actor, just as a target of convenience. So you need to make sure that you're not a target of convenience. The What else? I mean, you could have disgruntled employees. You could have people who are financially motivated inside the organization who are going to be naughty and embezzle something. You could have political actors willing to do things to your organization for political motivation. So your run-of-the-mill hacktivists. In terms of visibility, if I'm a Russian mobster trying to lock up your systems with ransomware, I don't really care if you see me. If I'm a spy agency or somebody looking to embezzle funds or otherwise defraud the organization that I work for, well, now vulnerability or visibility rather is a little bigger deal to me. So, who are we trying to emulate there? Um, if it's a red team exercise where the gloves are off and you can do whatever you want to the blue team, different story. In terms of sophistication, are we emulating Fancy Bear, or are we emulating Jim's kid who took Rosema's class on pen testing and has got this Kali Linux box and just really excited to do some damage with it? I think where the big divide comes down is there's sort of I sort of figured out how Metasploit works gang of script kiddies. And then there's sort of this middle ground of folks who understand not only like the Metasploit piece, but the fundamental protocols and the common configuration errors and stuff like that in this sort of middle zone. And then on the other end of that, you get to the people who are like winning the pwn to own competition and have a bevy of 0 days in their arsenal that they can use, like the NSA did with Eternal Blue for however many years, where they've got O days that nobody else knows about and they can do all sorts of things. So like there's kind of a spectrum of sophistication there. The more sophisticated the attacker we're trying to emulate, the more you're probably going to pay that pen tester for doing their work. Because the further away from just an automated tool that you click scan with towards a customized, piece of malware like written specifically for your organization, a lot of variation on what that's going to set you back. Who are we concerned with? What type of resources would our attacker have at their disposal? If it's the GRU, pretty much infinity, and if it's one 400-pound hacker alone in their bedroom, as is a thing that happens, I guess. What are they up to? Where are they going to be at? So depending, like you can't hack a wireless network on the other side of the planet. So are they going to be physically proximate to what you're doing? That's definitely like true for an outside attacker who is able to get close enough to your parking lot to see your Wi-Fi versus an inside attacker who's like proximate to not only the Wi-Fi, but also to like NFC things and card readers and all that kind of fun stuff. So the pen testers need to be in the appropriate space for the job. In terms of relationship, are we emulating like the Target hack where an HVAC vendor is the vector through which we got in? So they already had access to coming into a building, to maybe a server room to set up their stuff. I was always suspicious of the AT&T people who came to my business units to check the batteries on their UPSs. For some reason, they had a bunch of UPSs that like to catch on fire, and I always got suspicious when some strange person was like, "Hi, I'd like to spend 30 minutes alone in your server room, please." Even though we had a relationship, and even though I knew they were coming, it still made me nervous every time we let them do it. And then how much do they know about the target? Like, do they have inside knowledge? If the adversary we are emulating is an inside threat, they know a lot about the target probably. If they are outside of the organization, if they're doing a black box test, we might not know nothing about those folks. They might have to do all their own intelligence gathering, which is going to be expensive and take time. And can we trust them to do that? So, okay, there's threat actors on a number of different axes. Axes. And this is sort of who we're watching out for. So from script kiddies all the way to nation states, some of these, like these are non-exclusive. You can have script kiddies become advanced persistent threats. You can have hacktivists who are insiders. You can have competitors who are any one of these really, script kiddies or organized criminals who are funded by nation states. So there's a lot of cross between those two. Script kiddies is generally folks who are running scripts that they didn't write themselves and maybe don't understand. Hacktivism is when we are doing things for political gains. We were talking about this in our intro to security class as a um, one man's cyber terrorist is another man's cyber freedom fighter. So somebody doing something for a political purpose. Organized criminals are definitely everybody's worry these days as locking up your hard drive has started to become valuable. I didn't realize how big a deal this was, but seeing as how there are businesses going to jail for and getting giant fines for hacking their competition, this is a thing where somebody either hires a firm or tasks their own employees with hacking competitors. You can see how that can. I guess it's usually the equation is like if doing the thing and getting caught adjusted for risk is more valuable than not doing the thing, do the thing tends to be like the calculus of how businesses decide things. So apparently doing the thing with the hacker adjusted for risk is smarter than paying the fine if you get caught.
Didn't what was it, like Ticketmaster? Somebody do that to a competitor, and like they did get some like big fine or something, but they're like, okay, we're still fine afterwards, and the other competitor's gone.
Yeah, I hope they got like a big fine plus a service fee on top of that fine for providing the service of hacking them. That was who I was thinking of with the competitor
Okay.
thing. I think Ticketmaster's evil to begin with. So, and then on the higher, so like competitors are a big deal. Insiders again are terrifying. If you've got disgruntled employees, if you've got somebody who's just doing it wrong with their system or trying to commit your garden variety white collar crimes, embezzling or overpaying a vendor or colluding with a vendor to rip people off, that's no good. Nation states are everybody's problem these days, especially if you're like running an email server for a political party. They're interested in you. But also, if you work in any sort of infrastructure role, there are people in one of the security groups I belong to who work for electrical utilities. They're concerned about nation state actors, pretty big. And then anybody who can become an advanced persistent threat is a problem. So if you are a organization who has high value data, you should be concerned about APTs. If there's anything that makes your business special, APTs should be a concern, which gives you a great excuse to ask for more cybersecurity budget from your management type. So ideally, you can work target selection a couple of ways. You could have the client go through and whitelist things that are inside a scope. Um, so these are the things that you are allowed to get to, and do that by IP address, by MAC address, maybe wireless access points that are in scope, ranges of IP addresses, that sort of thing. Or you can do it the other way and say the following things are off limits and everything else is in limit. This would probably be for organizations that are a little more risk averse, and blacklists for those organizations that are less risk averse and willing to take a flyer that you might pop something that's gonna be a problem. You could also use any of these dimensions in order to figure it out. So anything we own is in scope. Anything that is in this physical location but nothing in this physical location. The following users are in scope. The following applications are in scope. And then we've got these security things that we want out of scope. So if you have an intrusion prevention system on your network, a wily pen tester or hacker can turn your intrusion prevention system into a own goal network denial of service tool and simulate attacks from other things in the network and use that IPS to knock things off. Or if it's an app sec test, you're testing application security of some kind of server, you might make sure the web application firewall is either out of scope or off or willing to get beat up pretty bad over the course of the pen test. So you might want exceptions specifically for the security gear. How are we holding up? So far, so good. All right, we're like 3 hours in here. You guys are hanging on. Because threat modeling is fun. You should do this in your own life and think about, in terms of like your personal security, who it is you're concerned with. I mean, for most of us, that's just basically your run-of-the-mill, Russian mob hackers, bad guys who are looking to rip you off, that kind of thing. If you're a cybersecurity professor, you might be concerned that some of your students would get cute, although that's probably leading into the paranoid. Although I do get this message from a recruiting firm every 6 months or so that I am sure is the Chinese government checking up on me to make sure my resume is still up to date.
Well, what's my favorite thing? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
Exactly. But just because they're out to get you doesn't mean you should be paranoid either. Understand what your threat looks like. You can go through and you can draw these things out for if you want to look at the components of a system to like visualize how it works. And that's usually either you look at the processes involved or you look at the data that's involved. And so you can diagram how the data flows through a system, and based on that, say like where could we potentially have somebody, attacking us on that, or where on this path is there an opportunity for somebody to get in. Sometimes that's called an attack tree, where you go through and you create a flow chart of the different ways you can do that. Like these are where failures of imagination happen. But once you've come up with like this is a list of attacks, next step would be to go through and rank them based on likelihood and by the impact. So you create some kind of grid where you've got like high, middle, or low in terms of likelihood, and then high, middle, or low in terms of impact. And you create the stuff that is both high and high, probably need to worry about that. Stuff that is both low and low, probably don't need to worry about that too much. So that helps us figure out what we need to worry about. There is a bunch of formal methodologies that are around for doing threat modeling. And you should at least be familiar enough with these to probably like know what the acronyms are for and who makes them. So STRIDE is spoofing. Whoops. And you'll find these in the book too. Spoofing, what is it? Spoofing, tampering, repudiation. I'm not going to write that whole word. That's too much. Information disclosure. And then denial of service is also thrown in that D. And then elevation of privilege. So that's Microsoft's methodology. And say what you will about Microsoft, they've really like taken the lead on coming up with like AppSec defenses and system defenses. Like we have regularly scheduled patching because Microsoft led the charge on that. Octave is operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability. Operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability evaluation. And that's CERT and CMU's joint. Trike is basically focused on finding an acceptable level of risk. I don't even think that's an acronym for anything. PASTA is the process for attack simulation and threat analysis. VAST is the visual, agile, simple threat modeling framework. And this one, the idea is you can integrate it with your Scrum-based, agile, DevSecOps, mobile, blah, blah, blah methodology that you use for your stuff. So those seem like really easy questions to throw on a certification exam. So if that is where your goal is, I'd make sure I was familiar with all of those. We talked about scope creep when the process gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Not just a penetration testing problem. Scope creep's a possible disaster with all sorts of IT technology and just regular old project management problems. So this is not just pen tests that suffer from scope creep or military endeavors. You'll hear that from the military as well. So sometimes it turns out things are more complicated than they were supposed to be for sure. Sometimes clients just say, hey, could you test this other thing as long as you're at it? And that's when you probably should be like, hey, we didn't put this into our scope. And if you want to redefine our scope, we're probably going to need to charge you more dollars to do that. So that is kind of the ban hammer you can use on your clients attempting to creep the scope. Oh, sure, we would be delighted to do that. Let me get Bill from sales over here to get you a quote on what that's going to set you back. All right, I think that's all the stuff we wanted to talk about for engagement. You ready for a pop quiz on this one?
Let's do it.
All right.
Yeah. It's a shame this class started with like 4 or 5 people.
I scared everybody off is what it is. They're like, oh, that was fun for a minute. But
oh, you mean I actually have to show my video on here? Ooh, no.
This is really going to put a crimp in my League of Legends practice. All right, engagement scope. Though your organization, through is how you say that word, your organization, you've seen a pattern of attacks of different types. Login attempts, malware, phishing, application exploits, and so on. That's almost all of them. None of the individual tactics are exotic. Many of them are stealthily executed. So quiet, but not particularly sophisticated. The attack is seemingly endless. But you think it's all the work of the same group of attackers. What type of attackers are these? Choose the best response. Are we talking about an APT? Are we talking about hacktivists? Are we talking about insiders or script kiddies?
Would it be an APT since it seems to be endless?
I think that we've definitely hit on persistence for sure. Although none of the attacks are that exotic, actually might make me reconsider that. I
was gonna say I was also kind of leaning towards script kiddie because a lot of that stuff is like, if it's not exotic, it's pretty easy to make, some phishing emails. And
that was my first thought, but they also mentioned stealthily executed, and the whole idea behind script kiddie is that they are just using other people's work and don't know what they're doing, and so I didn't think that stealthy would be in the cards.
Yeah, I think that's where the beautiful proficiency rainbow from like script kiddie to advanced persistent elite hacker. You're past script kiddie somewhere when you're being stealthful about it, and maybe script kiddies are one and done. Although
what do you mean?
You could have an advanced persistent script kiddie.
What do you mean? Nmap said it was a stealth scam. What do you mean they detected it?
How did that ever happen? What factor most, speaking of, distinguishes script kiddies from other adversaries? Capabilities, intent, location, or visibility.
Capabilities.
That one was too easy.
Yeah.
You're performing some threat modeling and you've decided to focus on process flow rather than data flow. What are the advantages it might have over a data flow diagram? So what's better about looking at processes over data? Easier to explain to less technical personnel, gives a high level of overall detail, more compatible with the typical network design documentation, represents the perspective of a real attacker moving through the system, or shows trust boundaries within the systems. So this is process flow versus data flow.
Well, A for one.
Yeah, and choose all that apply. So
yeah, no, that's why I said.
I think E looks like it would apply as well.
Trust boundaries.
Because we're talking about the well, no.
D. All right, A and D. I think that's what our book says too.
Yeah.
I wanted to hear the case for E though. Trust boundaries within the system.
No. As soon as I said that, I was like, that doesn't sound. That sounds more like data than process.
But as we watch one process leads to the next, to the next, to the next, we can see kind of what the attacker would see on our network too. All right, as a part of a penetration test, you've been told to target any wireless network you find, provided they don't match a specific list of SSIDs. What type of list are we talking about here? This is one of those reverse negative logic questions.
I could see this being scope creep.
It would be scope creep if they gave us a list of SSIDs and then they said,
The
oh, by
same
the
thing.
way, test these ones too.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just saying, like, you know, they might have like a specific list, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, we forgot about those ones. Please test those too.
That
That's
part
the
would
same
be.
thing.
Go ahead.
But that's an example of blacklisting.
Tyler gave you away that time. I heard him over there. Yeah, because they've said specifically, hey, don't test this list of black things that we don't want you to mess with. But it is one of those ones where you could have got to whitelisting just by flipping it around. All right. In the middle of a penetration test, it becomes obvious some servers not included in scope are extremely relevant to the test goals. The client sends an urgent message requesting them to be added to scope. Choose the best response. Assure the client that it can be taken care of while you investigate the situation more closely. Check the statement of work for guidelines on scope alteration. Explain that expanding scope will lead to increased testing time and cost. Explain that expanding scope will cause other aspects of the test to suffer since testing time is already fixed.
B.
Yeah, I liked B for that
Yeah,
one.
that's where I was gonna go to. B.
Yeah, good idea.
Check the guidelines.
We have a document that says exactly this. Okay, that is all of the engagement scope. We will do scripting next time around. Any other questions about all that? Falder on. All right, then I will fade to black and we will stop this recording.